أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق الأجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا حبيبنا حبيب قلوبنا وشفيء نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. أما بعد فقد قال الله في كتابه المبين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد. Respected brothers and sisters, inshallah, with the tawfiq that we have acquired and inshallah with the tawfiq that we will have, we will be resuming with our discussion on the mawdu' of the two parallel journeys, the two parallel voyages. We spoke yesterday about the concept of our series and the theme of our series and how the ubiquitous nature of Karbala has permeated not just across all time but also across all places. We saw in our discussion yesterday that there must be something universal. There must be something within inside the seeds of the message of Ashura and of Karbala that allows us to be speaking about it over 1,000 years ahead. And we discussed and concluded that the basis of this universal phenomena must be the fact that it is rooted in an archetype of the soul and the journey of the soul itself. Therefore, we began our journey of the soul yesterday, where we stated that after the creation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked us a question. And that question was, Alastu bi rabbikum? And we all, the Quran continues with the ayah, stated, Qalu bala, shahidna. We all stated and we all mentioned with absolute certainty that we testify and we believe in the truth and we have certainty and yaqeen in regards to what the haqq is. And as I mentioned, this is a parallel journey, and the parallel aspect to this first step was, of course, the first step of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. When he began his journey, he began it with absolute certainty, did he not? He began it with absolute yaqeen. He started his journey, leaving Medina, knowing full well what was going to happen to him. And that's where we actually begin in our voyage. So I would like us to bear the underlying premise of the series in mind. That in essence, what this series is a 10-step journey towards becoming insan kamil, like Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. What this series is, in essence, is a 10-step journey towards perfecting ourselves. The first step we covered yesterday by saying that we need to tap in to our internal certitude. We need to tap in to the internal yaqeen that we have. We need to first of all accept that we have the truth within inside us. We have the yaqeen within inside us, and we do need to trust the intuitions that we have. Once we understand that we have these base intuitions and they are based within inside the truth, then we move on to the next step of the journey, which is the discussion for today. However, as I mentioned, this certitude is not a false or pseudo-certitude that we may convince ourselves of sometimes. We want something to happen because of the ego. We want something to happen because of ourself. We want something to happen because of our nafs. And because of this, we trick ourselves into this pseudo-certainty to say that I am doing this thing for rightful reasons. And I'm doing this thing for righteous reasons. However, as I mentioned, if an individual simply takes account of their day and truly, with ikhlas, sits down, they would be able to decipher what the right course is and where the truth actually lies. We mentioned the component of social activism and social awareness yesterday, when we said that this certitude leads itself to a social understanding, and we said that spirituality devoid of a social understanding is not spirituality at all. And we see a combination of fulfilling our obligations to ourselves, to our community, whether it be national or international, is part and parcel of what it means to be a Husseini, and is part and parcel of what it means to be spiritual. Therefore, the journey of our soul continues, and we move on to the second step. After the creation of the ruh and after the creation of the soul, after the mithaq itself, where we had agreed to the veracity of the truth of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we stated that we believe and we testify, we move on to the next stage. where is the journey of the soul going? This is a journey that you have all experienced, and this is a journey that I have experienced. After our souls were created in alim arwah, we see that's one of the later stages, and the second step for today is that of the descent into the earth. When our soul descends into the earth, we see that this certitude itself does not leave us. This yaqeen that we had remains there. However, there are now additional factors and elements that come into our journey that may make this certainty obscure, that may make this certainty veiled. And this is where we have the invitation of the ego itself. So the second stage of the journey of the soul is, after we have obtained the certainty from the first stage, we now need to tackle with the ego and the nafs al-ammara in the second stage. This stage is an important one, and the correlation to Karbala is also incredibly important. However, I think the first question that we must ask ourselves is, what need do we have for the nafs al-ammara? Because the nafs al-ammara is, in the second stage of our journey, something that is quite insidious, something that derails us entirely, something that takes us away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So a logical question that an individual may ask is, what need do we have for the descent into chaos? What need do we have when we had that original certainty and yaqeen, for us to now have an element within inside us that pushes us towards the hells rather than pushes us towards the heavens? Why do we need to have this component within inside us that feeds on greed, that feeds on jealousy, that feeds on envy, and that feeds on anger? What possible benefit can a merciful Lord devise for me by putting such an element within inside me, by putting the nafs al-ammara within inside me? We see that there are a few answers given to this question. However, the most profound, I would say, given to us by the ulama, the urafa, and the ma'asumeen are as follows. The first answer to this very important question is, what need do we have for the nafs al-ammara? Why? What's the purpose? Why do we need to go through so much pain and trouble and torment for us to follow this meaning and purpose that we have in life? And we see the works of history tell us, and the works of theology tell us, that true certainty has to be tested. True certainty must go through some sort of test. We see certainty is not certainty until your beliefs have been put under fire. Certainty is not certainty until we have gone through some pressure. Take yourselves to a situation in your lives where you believed something to be true. However, now you had some backlash to it, and you now start asking yourselves, was I genuinely on the right path? Was I genuinely upon the truth? So if we originated from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with this certainty, with this yaqeen, when He stated, Alastu bi rabbikum, and we all responded with bala, we have this certainty. However, the only way we can truly test this certainty is how? By going through this pain, by going through this suffering, and by going through this torment. And we would see that, like any decision in our life, this certainty that we possess can only be solidified if it is tested. Therefore, the tests that we go through on a day-to-day basis are not to derail us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't introduce the concept of nafs al-ammara simply for the sake of it, but rather we see it's a foundational theological and philosophical doctrine that states that only when certainty is tested can we truly understand it to be true. How bad do we want this to be true? How badly do we seek life? How truly do we seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Only in the sincerity and the depth of our belief would we only understand that our prior certainty was true. Only by understanding that there will be backlash, there will be trials, and there will be tribulations, we will see that the initial certainty we had when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created our souls turns out to be true. The second point in response to the question of why do we need this lower self? Why do we need the carnal desires? Why do we need an element and disposition of the human soul that takes us away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Which is entirely paradoxical to our purpose on earth. We see comes to an incredibly important argument. And that argument is that of jabr wa ikhtiyar. We see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't want us to be forced to choose Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to give us the free will to choose Him. Therefore, if we are in a situation where we can be misguided by temptation, however, we still choose the truth, then our certainties are alive. If we have the temptations and the ability to choose something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we still choose Him, we did this out of our free will. If we have the opportunity and the ability to follow shaitan and to follow our carnal desires, and we still choose Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we did this out of our own free will. And we did this out of our own ikhtiyar. Therefore, if we understand this argument, we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the freedom of choice by placing the nafs al-ammara within inside us. He states, I am giving you the opportunity to go in any direction you please. However, if you want to stay true by that original certitude that I bestowed upon you when your soul was created, you must follow your fitrah, and you must follow your soul, and you must follow your certitude upon the trials and the tribulations. Understanding that point, we see in a general day-to-day basis, it's not difficult to understand. In our personal relationships, whether it be with your mother, whether it be with your father, whether it be with your siblings, we see that whether it's an individual near to us or close or far away, if we want to preserve this relationship, we struggle for it, do we not? If we want to maintain this relationship, we stay away from temptations, do we not? If you are married and you have a relationship with this individual, you get rid of temptations because of your love for this individual. If you have a mother and if you have a father and you want to make sure that their feelings are preserved, what do? You get rid of the temptations that come to you that invite you towards anger, that invite you towards greed, that invite you towards lust, that invite you towards your carnal desires. Why? We have these things within inside us. Why do you decide to put them aside for the sake of your relationship with this individual? Because you deem this relationship to be the truth, and you deem this relationship to be certain, and you deem this relationship to be in lines with haqq and reality. Therefore, if we deem these relationships to be worthy of us putting our temptations on the side and pursuing them, I ask you, is our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not worthy of us putting our temptations on the side and seeking Him? Is our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not worthy enough for us to control our nafs al-ammara, and then out of the opportunity to sin, we choose not to and still develop our relationship with Him due to our proximity? So for these two major reasons, we can see the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our second stage, after the creation of the soul, has introduced the concept of the nafs al-ammara within inside us. He introduced this concept so that we can always have the freedom to choose. And we see that the valor in decision is only ever in the freedom to choose. If there's no freedom to choose, there's no valor in decision. And there's no merits that can actually be afforded to them. So the second step of our journey is the descent onto earth of the soul. After we were created, we were descended onto the earth. And after we were descended onto the earth, we see that we are now embedded with carnal desires that have the ability to take us away from the truth. However, if we choose to, they have the ability to propel us towards the haqq. Now, as I mentioned, this series is two parallel journeys. One of the journey of the human soul and one of the tragedy of Imam Hussein. So we mentioned the first parallel, the certainty of the soul upon creation and the certainty of Imam Hussein when he left Medina. Now the second stage, we see that when the ego is introduced and when temptation is introduced in the human soul at this particular stage, what stage of Imam Hussein's journey does this correspond with? We see that when Imam Hussein was requested by the Shia of Kufa to come and to allow them to be a part of his force, we see this is a perfect part of our juncture and journey that shows us the actual introduction of the ego, that shows us the actual introduction of the nafs, and the actual introduction of temptation, and how in a very real and physical example, these things can take us away from the very certainty that we do believe in. Inshallah, if you're all with me, can we have a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad? Now, looking at this particular part of the journey of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, as we mentioned yesterday, he set off from Medina and he was on his way to Mecca. And when he was on his way to Mecca, we see that he was invited there and he was welcomed there with a lot of pomp and glamour. The individuals were very happy to receive him, and they were very happy to have him in Mecca. Now, while he was there, he didn't receive 1 or 2 letters from the Shia of Kufa. He received many, telling him that we are aware of the current situation, that the death of the previous Khalifa has occurred, and you have rejected the bay'ah of the new Khalifa. So we would like to invite you formally to come to Kufa so we can start a revolution, we can start a revolt, and we now may be of your followers. Imam Hussein, of course, he reads this, and as I said, it's not 1 or 2. When he reads these letters, he now entrusts this to who? He now entrusts his very close companion by the name of Muslim ibn Aqil. Now, Muslim, at this point in time, is given the task by Imam Hussein. He says that you need to go to Kufa. When you go to Kufa, I would like you to see if the situation is as they say it is, that there are people flocking to be by my side. There are people flocking to pledge allegiance to us. There are people waiting to give their oaths. And only at that point in time will I come. So please go and assess the situation, because I can't simply trust a few letters that have reached my person. Muslim accepts. He begins his journey towards Kufa, and the journey was filled with a lot of trials and a lot of tribulations. However, nonetheless, he reached. When he reached Kufa, we see that he was welcomed with open arms. And the Shia of Kufa now started collecting. The house that he went to, the build-up became so much that Muslims saw that the letters most verily were true. When a decent amount of the Shia were now around the Muslim, he read the letter of Imam Hussein. When he read the letter of Imam Hussein, the individuals there began to weep, the traditions narrate. Now this took me back to myself, brothers and sisters. When the letter of Imam Hussein is read in the Majalis of Aba Abdullah, and I sit there and I weep, to what extent am I weeping out of my belief in certitude? And to what degree am I weeping as an emotional response? When we look at the Shia of Kufa, of course, all of us know the end of the story. We see that they are weeping at this point in time when the letter of Imam Hussein is read. And they say that we pledge allegiance to Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. And we are ready for him to come so that we may take over the governor. The governor was an individual by the name of Nu'man ibn Bashir. And this governor was an individual who, of course, was appointed by the Khalifa. However, he was an individual who was not too much in a haste to make rash actions. So when this letter was read, and then Muslim took account of the individuals who were around him, he sent a letter back to Imam Hussein and he stated, the number differs. However, the strongest account would be 18,000. There are 18,000 individuals here ready to come and pledge allegiance to you should you come to Kufa and help them. Help them overthrow the current governor so that they may be ruled independently. So the letter is now sent, and of course word gets back to the governor. Word gets back to Nu'man ibn Bashir. And he is now hearing that an individual by the name of Muslim ibn Aqil has come to Kufa, and he has now a support of 18,000 plus people. What to do here? He now gathers everyone at the Great Mosque and he states that this is a firm warning to you all. If any of you decide to resist, if any of you decide to revolt, if any of you decide to take any action against the Khalifa of our time, I will be harsh in my response. However, he said that I will not start any aggression. I will not begin by attacking. However, if you begin, our response would be hard. Now, some of the individuals who were, you would say, sympathetic to the Khalifa, they sent a letter back to Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And in this letter, they stated that this individual is far too soft, this Nu'man ibn Bashir. And he's not taking decisive action. So we need you to send someone who can actually quell this rebellion that is coming. Can you imagine a revolution was about to occur? A revolt was going to happen in the Islamic Empire. So he stated, we'd like you to send someone who is competent for the job and who is competent for the role. He will take decisive action and will be harsh and aggressive upon entry. And this is where we have the introduction of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. Now he is now sent as the governor of Kufa. And as the governor of Kufa, he goes, and of course, as the job description stated, He started very aggressively. He went to the Great Mosque and he started an announcement. He said that we are now going to start aggressive action against this group who have claimed to come and overthrow the governor, because this is a crime against the governor and it is a crime against the Khalifa. So as this happens, of course, Muslim ibn Aqil is there, and he is there with all of his companions. So he says, now is the time that we need to strike. He goes to the palace of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. He goes to the palace of this individual, and they start the battle, and they start the war. This, the next few sentences, is what has now become famous as the story of the Shia of Kufa. It states that the war then begun, and of course, a huge amount of people were there. And Ubaydullah, his strategy was as follows. He of course threatened them with physical violence. He of course threatened them with saying that morally, I will beat you down. However, in addition to that, he called the elders of Kufa. When he called the elders of Kufa, he said, convince your people not to stand against me, because it would be very bad for them. So here we can see that this great force of 4,000, we would say at the first instance, and 18,000 in total, is now starts to dissipate, and the numbers grow lower and lower. They shrink by the minute. And we see that the arguments that the traditions put forward are incredibly interesting, and they really strike a nerve. Because we see, even though it was a very long time ago, it's something that we definitely face today. It states that one of the major arguments that the elders of Kufa put forward were that you don't have to be with Muslim ibn Aqil. There are many others to defend him. Do we not hear this? There are many other people to do what you are doing. It's not necessary for you to sacrifice. There are other people who can look after the poor. You don't need to do what you are doing. There are other people who can defend the weak. You don't need to be doing what you are doing. However, here we can see that we have misunderstood the religion in its entirety. We see that the true enemy lies within, and the true enemy is the nafs itself. In the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, he states, your greatest enemy is by no means external. Your greatest enemy is by no means the outside, and that's something that we afford to ourselves, is it not? It's always someone else. It's always something else. It's never us. It's never our responsibility. He says the greatest enemy is not external, but rather your greatest enemy is your own nafs. So when we understand that case, and taking us back to the current stage of the story of Muslim ibn Aqil, we see that it wasn't the external enemy that was really hurting the forces of Imam Hussein, of Muslim ibn Aqil, but rather it was the internal nafs, where they stated that there will be other people who can help them. You are not required. Because we have simply reduced religion to outcomes orientation, have we not? Only if the outcome is affected will I do something. Only if the outcome is affected will I change. What's the point of me doing this? Is not going to make a difference anyway. Have we not said this at some point in our life? If I do this something positive, it's not going to make a difference to the total. It's not going to make a difference to the outcome. It's not going to make a difference to the goal. Therefore, one person, what difference is it going to make if I partake in this or if I do not partake in this? If I engage in this or I do not engage in this, what difference would it ultimately make? However, as I mentioned, this miscalculation of the religion is the reason why the army of Muslim ibn Aqil lost in Kufa, and is the reason why we continue to lose the battles within inside our own souls. It's got nothing to do with the outcome, brothers and sisters. It's got nothing to do with the external. It's got to do with the position of our own soul. I agree with you, it would not change the outcome. I agree with you, it would not change that which is external. But the purpose of me partaking in an action is not to change something externally, but rather to change something internally. I see that I have a state of my soul. And if there is something that I must do, and I do not do this, the state of my soul is now polluted. That's what's been damaged. If I have something that is wajib upon me, and I do not act upon this something that is wajib, forget externally what the effects are going to be. My internal state is now damaged. This is the argument of sinning in public and sinning in private, right? For example, if you're taking something in public, you would say, I would not do this. In private, you say, no one is looking. What difference does it make? This individual has so much more of this, it would not make a difference to them. You're entirely right. It would not make a difference to them. But what difference is it making to you? What value are you putting on your own soul? What value are you putting on your own self? So therefore, when we have this mentality of what difference would it make in the grand scheme of things, we are seeing that we are undervaluing our own soul. And we are saying that the opinions and the externalities are of a higher value than the salvation of our very eternal soul. So if we understand this, then we start working a bit differently in society. That even if no one is looking, I observe the laws. Even if it doesn't make a difference, I observe the rules. Not because it would change anything externally, but rather because it would change my state internally. And the only thing that I'm going to take with myself in the akhirah, I ask you, is it going to be the opinions of people? Is it going to be the outcome or the state of the ummah? Or is it going to be the state of my soul and the a'mal that I have brought? Therefore, on that basis, the story continues. And it states that the influencing was occurring, and the elders were saying that leave it to other people. They will help him. You are not required. It states that the children of the soldiers were now clinging onto their legs and saying, leave them and come back home. We do not want the backlash and the onslaught that will happen afterwards. One by one, the force started dropping until the traditions narrate we got to a point of 30. So when we get to 30, we see that Muslim, of course, is now ending up on his own. And at this point in time, the entire army has dissipated. He is now walking through the streets of Kufa on his own, and he now takes his place in the house of an individual. Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad has now seen that the battle has been won. And he says that I would now like the capture of Muslim ibn Aqil. He finds him and he captures him. And there was a large confrontation. And during his capture, Muslim ibn Aqil managed to get word to Imam Hussein to state that we have been abandoned and we have been deceived. The same Shia of Kufa that was sending us letter upon letter. The same Shia of Kufa was saying that we want anything for you to come here. All of them have now left me, and I am now on my own, on my way to capture. So while he was there, he was in the presence of the Khalifa of the time, and then he was commanded to swear allegiance to the Khalifa. And he said, this is something that I'm not going to do. He said, I will die a free man, are the words of Muslim. I will die a free man, and you can't compel me to do something I know not to be true. He tapped into that certainty and that yaqeen that he had. He implemented it in action, and he did not make any apologies for it. We see that he acted upon this, and he states that I will die a free man, and you can't compel me to say Salamu alaykum ya Amir al-Mu'mineen to any individual that I do not deem to be fit of the title. So he states that then at this point in time, you must take your life, he said, and he brings an incredibly beautiful quote here. He said, worse men than you have killed better men than me. Therefore, my life at this point in time is something that you can take. I die upon the truth, and I make no apologies for it. So this is where we see the martyrdom and the shahada of Muslim ibn Aqil. Now we need to bring this to the point of our discussion in our closing few minutes of our bahth today. We stated that the second stage of the journey of the soul is that of the introduction of temptation, is that of the introduction of the nafs al-ammara, is that of the introduction of carnal desires, is that of the introduction of distractions. So now we have all of these distractions in our life is the same way that we can say that the Shia of Kufa had these distractions. And how did they deal with them? And more importantly, we need to ask ourselves the question, how do we learn from this abandonment? And what do we learn from this abandonment? We see that the abandonment of Muslim ibn Aqil, again, is not just there as a historical story, but rather we need to take something away from it. And we see that there are many lessons to take away from the abandonment of Muslim ibn Aqil. One of the real lessons that we can take away from the abandonment is that emotion without commitment, it flails very quickly. So if we believe something to be true, and sometimes us in our lives, we're very emotional about things that we believe to be true, right? However, the only thing that can actually make it cemented and for us to have certitude within inside it is for us to commit it into action. Is for us to commit it into amal. Because if there is not that, I ask you, was there any lack of this emotion by the Shia of Kufa? They were sending letters upon letters. They were sending envoys and messengers. They were sending word and saying that we have this pledge and this oath for you. All you need to do is come. So therefore, when I take account of my life, I need to say, how many actions am I taking out of emotion? How many actions am I taking out of simple passion? And how many actions am I taking out of commitments to the amal? Another lesson we can learn from this abandonment is what? Another lesson that we can learn from the abandonment is that fear can overtake the most sincere of intentions. The Shia of Kufa were not insincere, right? This was not a plan of deceit. This wasn't a plan of a coup. Rather, we can see that all of them had the best of intentions. All of them were there and they knew that Imam Hussein was upon the haqq. And they knew that Imam Hussein was upon the right path. So if they knew that he was upon the haqq and they knew that he was on the right path, what is it that swayed them away? This introduction of the ego, this introduction of distractions, and the introduction of fear. So we can see that fear is most definitely something that can take us away from the most sincere of intentions. The most sincere of intentions. In addition, there are many other factors that we can contribute to this abandonment. Of course, as I mentioned, emotion without commitment and fear itself drew a lot of people away. However, the main message that we need to take away is how can we avoid this abandonment? Because this abandonment is symbolic, right? Is the abandonment of ourselves. Is the abandonment of our truth. Is the abandonment of haqq. So how can we avoid this abandonment? One, the first way that we can actually avoid this abandonment is to understand that whenever we look at certainty, certainty is only fulfilled in action. Therefore, if I act upon my certitude, if I act upon my certainty, only then can I truly say, I have yaqeen. Only in the land of amal and in the land of akhlaq can I truly say that I have made good upon the yaqeen that I have. If I simply talk in theoretics, we see that there is no virtue to this. There is no value to this. However, if I act upon my certitude, that is what takes me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, brothers and sisters, if you know something to be true after thought and contemplation, if you know something to be true after researching and reading, if you have yaqeen and certitude in this, it's now wajib upon you to act. It's now wajib upon you to introduce this in the land of amal. We have a tradition, again by Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, where he states that knowledge is not knowledge until it's actualized, right? And it's the same with certitude, and it's the same with yaqeen. I can have certainty all day long. If I don't act upon this certainty, if I don't act upon this yaqeen, I ask you, what yaqeen is this in reality? And what certitude is this? Therefore, if I believe something to be true, it now becomes my responsibility to implement it. It becomes my responsibility to act upon it. And if I do, that is how I can refrain from this abandonment. The second point is being honest to ourselves about fear. All right? When we look at fear, we see that this is something natural. And fear is something that will come in our life. But we need to be honest to ourselves about it. When we make a decision, and when we're looking at life, and when we can choose the path of right or wrong, we can choose the path of haqq or batil, sometimes the element of fear comes into play. As for the soldiers of Muslim ibn Aqil against the army of Ibn Ziyad. So all we need to do is be honest with ourselves, because fear is something that will always remain. This is a human trait and we all feel this. However, now we can't superimpose our fear and say that we are doing this out of righteousness, and we are doing this out of truth, and we are doing this out of haqq. But rather we must take accountability and responsibility and state that I am doing this despite the fear that I am feeling, or I am not doing this because of the fear that I am feeling. However, when we start conflating the truth with falsehood, when we start conflating these two things, it becomes a very dangerous ground. We see that there are many traditions that state that we have this yaqeen and certainty within inside us. We have this truth. We have this certitude. However, how does it become covered? In the hadith, they use the word veils, right? You've heard this. It says that the certitude is then covered with veils, veils of sin. But what does this actually mean pragmatically and practically? Every time I sin, my certitude becomes blurred. Why? What correlation is there with me sinning and my certainty becoming dimmer? You see, the certainty doesn't become dimmer, it simply becomes covered. Think of the reflection of a moon in the water. If the water moves, the reflection of the moon changes. However, the moon is still there. Our certitude always exists in its finest form, which is why we can see sometimes non-Muslims, they listen to something and connect to it to such a large degree because that root of certainty still exists. The light of certainty does not go out. However, the veils that cover it may increase. So it states that the veils themselves, what are they? The veils themselves are sin. But again, what correlation is there with the dampening of the light of my certitude and the increase of my sin? They said that the correlation is this. Every time I make a decision or every time I act out of a reality that I believe something to be true and it's not, I've now created another reality for myself. And I've now created another truth. And I've now created another certitude. I'm not doing this thing because I'm scared. But I don't want to say I'm scared. So I now try to give myself a morally understandable reason in regards to why I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this because I think that it's the wrong thing to do. You've created another certainty. You've created another certainty. You possess a certainty that yaqeen is now dulled. So therefore, the importance of us actually working in line with the truth is this, is that this yaqeen and certainty that we have within inside us needs to be tapped into and manifested. And if we do not, then of course it's something that is quite dangerous. In our remaining 2 minutes, inshallah, we will conclude our discussion. And the conclusion will be as follows. We saw the second stage of the journey of the soul, which is the descent from alim al-arwah into the earth that we are currently in. And this descent, of course, is attached to the combination of the soul to the carnal desires and the ego. And we see that the parallel of this stage in the story of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein is the temptation and the ego and the desires that came to the soldiers of Muslim ibn Aqil. Now we can see that these particular individuals, they unfortunately succumb to their temptation. And we mentioned the reasons of succumbing to those temptations and how we can actually bring ourselves out of it. So we finish on this point. When we look at an individual like Umar ibn Sa'ad, we see that he knew what the truth was. However, he decided not to act upon it. Why? Because for him, the land and the governorship of Ar-Ray was more valuable than what was going on there. He was saying that my land and my wealth and these things, I can't compromise them. I can't get rid of them. Therefore, I'm going to compromise my yaqeen and certitude that Imam Hussein is upon the truth so that I may pursue a war against him. So we must now conclude and ask ourselves the question, what is our Ar-Ray, brothers and sisters? What is the thing that distracts us from the truth? What's the thing that tempts us away from the truth? What's the thing that takes us further away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because everyone has their vices. We're all nothing but human. So what would be wise is for us to acknowledge it. What would be not wise is for us to understand it. And what would be wise would be for us to appreciate it. And the lessons that we take from the death of Muslim ibn Aqil are in that fashion and are in that manner. That when we look at aspects such as leadership like in Muslim ibn Aqil is sometimes something you need to do alone and something you need to do on your own. However, when it comes to our personal array and our personal governorship, we see that what holds the place of that in my life? And how can I actually identify this particular vice and be true and sincere with myself to say that this is something I am doing out of my best interest or something I am doing because it is genuinely the sake of the truth. Therefore, inshallah, tomorrow we will continue with our series and move on to the third step of the journey of the soul and the parallel correlation with the journey of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, and ultimately try to build our step day by day, ourselves day by day, in order to get to this final state of the journey of Imam Hussein and the final state of the soul, which of course is submission, which of course is taslim, and which of course is ultimate surrender to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وآخر دعوانا والحمد لله رب العالمين صلوات على محمد وآله الطاهرين.